But how do you create a civilization? How do you design a civilization? What are the blueprints for that civilization? What are the morals that would be laid down for that civilization? How is that civilization going to be governed? What are the rules going to be? That's what that symbol represents. It's the tools needed to create that entire civilization. So that's why you have a pine cone from the knowledge side, and then here is coming right next to it, holding. But notice he's not passing along. He's in some cases he's passing along the pine cone and passing along the bag, but in other cases he's holding it by his side as well. These individuals, they are the keepers of knowledge and the keepers of how to create civilizations. They're the ones that jump-started every major advanced, sophisticated civilization we can around the world. When we see lost civilizations, this is where these influences came from. They came from those who are passing along knowledge through the pine cone and the tools to create civilizations around the world. And that's why we find these two depictions so closely used in nearly every depiction, because what's the end game here? If you had an advanced group that wanted to design the infrastructure for a planet, design the infrastructure with cities, for what people would do, for how to run the world, how to clear river channels for agriculture, for how to map the heavens, you would need all of these different tools and knowledge to be able to do that. And that's what I really feel like these symbols represented when they're handing them down. But it goes even deeper too. And this is where it's a rabbit hole. It truly is. We find ample evidence all around the world, just like we found evidence for these symbols being shown, that there have been devastating catastrophes that have occurred on the earth. And maybe not even just during one time period, but maybe as a part of a cyclical basis, where maybe every 12,000 years, it seems like some disaster occurs, which is why they were so obsessed with mapping the heavens, because they could understand not only the energy of the cosmos, but they could also map and understand when events are going to happen, what time period is occurring on a larger level, looking at it more on the basis on the solar system level, not on looking at our understanding of time. So these civilizations were wiped out collectively around the world based on series of cataclysms we find. And we know that based on erosion we find around like the Sphinx enclosures. When we look at Greenland ice core samples, we see a very, very devastating event that occurred between about 12,800 and about 10,800 years ago, over potentially over 1,000-year period of multiple events that seem to have wiped out all of these civilizations and just left either just their megalithic structures that they built with no writing at all, or in some cases these cuneiform tablets, which was the ingenious way that they knew that they could preserve a message etched into stone or clay so that it would survive. That's why there's so few writings from any of these cultures anywhere in the world, because if they had used paper or anything digital, none of it would have survived. And so when some ask about, well, how do you know Atlantis was real? We don't have any of the writings from Atlantis, really. We have very little. We have anything that was either channeled or came through ancient Egypt, because Egypt was the only connection that we can find back to Atlantis when Solon went there and then told Plato about the story of Atlantis. So all we have, Willie, is basically these scraps and these little breadcrumbs left behind from what is disasters that we can't even wrap our heads around in terms of human history, for events that have occurred, for what happened to them, to be able to try to understand what this story is. And that's why it's so difficult, because we're talking about a culture, Willie and JP, that disappeared in many cases well over 10,000 years ago. So guys, this is what we're going to go some high level stuff now for those who love high level. In Göbekli Tepe, which is in the Anatolia region of Turkey, you see pillar 43, which is the most important of all the pillars there. Now, these pillars are massive megalithic pillars that are built out of a single stone. They're these huge T-shaped pillars, and they weigh more than 20 tons each. And they have all these strange depictions on them. The first thing to mention about pillar 43 is it has the handbag symbol at the very top, meaning the tools needed to create a civilization, right? So they're worshiping that knowledge and those tools that created their civilization. Why is that so interesting and important? I've mentioned this before, but I want to mention it again for those who don't know. Göbekli Tepe is one of the most important sites, not for its sophistication with megalithic giant blocks like we see in across Peru or in Egypt, not for that reason, but because it contains certain levels of archaeological evidence that helps us to really understand this story well, to back up this information. And what you find in Göbekli Tepe is that as they've uncovered different layers going down in, they found that this entire astronomical temple, which is what this was buried under mountains of debris, deliberately buried and hidden, closed off. When they finally got down and dug in and found this temple, they found that there were very peculiar layers of organic material within other layers that went down deep below that. And they were able to radiocarbon date that organic material to 11,800 years ago for this civilization in Göbekli Tepe that made that temple. So we know that. We know that base value. And we also know that that was the time period that was a lot of violent earth changes were happening based on ice core samples. The same destructive time period during the Younger Dryas period around 12,000 years ago. When they went down and uncovered those layers, remember, we're told that every civilization is simply nomadic hunter-gatherers, and they just, in terms of Göbekli Tepe, that what mainstream archaeologists tell us is that this group just happened to decide to stop hunting and hang out there for a few years and build the most sophisticated astronomical temple ever built. That makes a lot of sense, right? But what makes more sense is when you go down through the layers, you find that in the layers right below where this construction was done, we do find hunter-gatherer evidence, extensive hunter-gatherer evidence. There were hunter-gatherers moving through this region, but then right above it, within a very, very short amount of material, only within years, say, of material that could have been accumulated, we see all the sophistication that comes out of nowhere. Agriculture starts getting practiced. Cities are built. We find sophisticated society has emerged on this site out of nowhere, seemingly out of nowhere. And then what do we find on that pillar? Those handbags shown like if you were, let's say you were a hunter-gatherer group, you were living in that region, hunting wild animals and living off the land. And all of a sudden, this group of enlightened individuals comes in and teaches you all of this wisdom and knowledge. They completely change the structure of your society. They give you all these tools. They give you understandings of, they teach you how to farm. They teach you about the cosmos. They teach you about consciousness. They give you all this information and knowledge. They give you the tools to create those civilizations, and then they leave. What are you going to do? You're going to worship them. You're going to worship them, either them where they came from, or even just celestial understandings of energy, and we'll get into that in a second. But now look what's below the handbag symbols. We see a vulture, okay? And we see a vulture who's got a circular round thing above his arm. And some have speculated that that's a comet or an asteroid. Now look below the vulture, you see a scorpion. Now let me break this down. What I want to explain here and describe is, notice on the left, you have the handbag symbol in the top, and then you have the vulture and the scorpion. Now, if we look at up in the cosmos, we find that we see strikingly similarities with what's known as Cygnus. It's the constellation of Cygnus and Scorpius represent those depictions. And now they're in a very, look at the alignment of them. Not only are they shown on this cosmological chart, they're in the exact same position to each other. Look at Cygnus and look at Scorpius below it. Now at the top, Cygnus is connected to a star. See the hand of, or the wing of the vulture? There's a star right above its wing. That star happens to be called Deneb, and it's one of the brightest stars, not in our region, but the entire galaxy. One of the most illuminating stars in all of the galaxy happens to be right above Cygnus, but not just a coincidence. Think about the symbol of the cross, getting into symbols. The ancient cross, the most ancient symbol of all, which, by the way, predates Christian religions by thousands of years. In fact, these Anunnaki symbols that we're going to show in these murals, they have the symbol of the cross in many different places. It's one of the most ancient symbols of all, and To put this to bed too, the cross represents the crossing of energy, mind, body, and soul, the three ingredients for humans to reach ascension. That's what has been taught all throughout history. It's still the teachings of Jesus in the Roman Christian Bible. There's good information there, but it originally came from a much earlier place. It represented the crossing of energy. And it just so happens that Cygnus, it represents a constellation of a cross. And the one of the brightest stars in our entire galaxy happens to be the top of the cross, which would represent essentially ascension. I find that incredibly interesting. So we find Cygnus and Scorpius in this depiction at Göbekli Tepe with handbags right above it. Now, I'd like people to think about that for a little bit. What does that mean? Does that mean that those beings who provided, does it mean that they're the ones who brought those tools? There's just endless questions that go into that, but I want to leave people with that understanding of what's shown on that and how those handbag symbols are right above that. Now, there's one more incredibly interesting piece of the puzzle. Just so happens that Cygnus and Scorpius are in what's known as the dark rift of our galaxy. The dark rift is an area of the galaxy that has the highest amount of dark energy of our entire galaxy, is in that location. For those who don't know what dark energy is, it's when you think of a system of balance, as above, as below, you find when you look at something like the underworld and heaven, higher and lower dimensions, there's always balance no matter what. Dark matter would be like the equivalent of the underworld for our planet, but in the galaxy. It is the other side of matter. Everything is always balanced. Now, guys, this is probably, I would have to argue, my favorite depiction of any mural in the world. It may seem silly, but something like this can answer almost everything. Think about all the stuff we talked about. What does the pine cone mean? What does the handbag mean? They're right here, but we get a lot more information than just that. Now, guys, I'm going to break this whole thing down, and this is where I think is going to help connect a lot of pieces for people, a lot of these clues that remain hidden. Now, like a puzzle piece to try to put together this lost story of history, you take it one piece at a time. So once you know the pine cone means the passing of knowledge and wisdom, you put that piece into place. Then you understand how they're holding the handbag. You put that piece into place. If you have the understanding that beings that have wings, it's supposed to represent gods, ascended beings that are from other dimensions, you put that piece into place too. And what do you get? You get a depiction here that tells an entire story. It tells an entire story of what occurred in the past to create sophisticated civilizations. Now, let me break it down. Notice there's two individuals in the center that are surrounded by what's called the tree of life. And then there's two individuals on the outside. And then above the tree of life, you have the winged solar disk with Anu in the center, okay? Now, Anu is like running the wheels of this tree, this life, like balance. And the more you learn about the Anunnaki, the more you find that they're obsessed with maintaining balance. They did a lot of bad stuff here, but because of that, they had to do certain roles and responsibilities to regain that balance. And that's one of the obsessions they always have, no matter what you look at. That's why the tree of life is always depicted. This balance of life here, this balance of nature, the creation of life. It's all balanced by, according to them, the Anunnaki are in charge of that. That's their responsibility, okay? Now, I used to think that this was supposed to depict all of the Anunnaki. These were 4 Anunnaki. That's not right. That's incorrect, and it took me a long time to understand that. The way you know that is not just by the wings. Look at what they're wearing on their heads. Notice that very carefully. Besides wings, the Anunnaki, if they're shown with their physical head, not a serpent or an eagle, they're always shown the same way. They have horns, ringed horns around their helmet, and they always have 3. That's a status symbol for the Anunnaki. That means that the 2 individuals on the outer side, and it doesn't really mean on either side. Remember, it represents both sides, right? Balance. The 4. The 2 on either end, and the 2 kings in the center. Now notice, the kings are the same height as the Anunnaki. And like I said, I think some things are supposed to be literal. right? Some things are symbolic, but other things are literal. They're the same height as the Anunnaki. Now look, the Anunnaki aren't reptilian. Remember, we're created in their image, not the other way around. We are them. So therefore, look at all the Mesopotamian kings that are depicted all throughout history. When we look at Ashur, when we look at King Hammurabi, when we look at Sennacherib, when we look at Ashurbanipal, notice they look just like the Anunnaki, like they're imitating them, right? They have the long locks of hair all braided. But what do they not have? Notice what's on their head. They don't have any horns. They have a completely different type of symbol on their head. And they don't have handbags or pine cones. You see that? It's telling you a story. Let me break this whole thing down. The Anunnaki had bloodline king offspring based on which are called the Nephilim. Okay, we know that when we look into we look into Genesis, we look into Book of Enoch, all kinds of ancient stories from the past. It extensively talks about that giants were once here, that ancient kings really weren't what we thought they were. They were actually like bloodline Anunnaki kings directly from their bloodline. And so their obsession here was to have their seed rule over the society. So these kings are direct bloodline kings of the Anunnaki. They're being given the knowledge and wisdom to create civilization. Okay? And that's why they're depicted in the center around the tree of life. Now notice what they're carrying. In their left arm, they have what's known as the masculine rod of kingship, of ruling. And it was always males that did the majority of these ancient civilizations were males. There were some civilizations in parts of Africa that were run by females. And there were some areas of Africa had female kings and priestesses and that was an example in areas, but in majority of the time, it were these bloodline males, these masculine rulers that would take over and rule society. And that's really what's being depicted here in the center. So they have the masculine rod, and then look what they're doing. Just like you see, they're pointing the way. It is their way or nothing. They are handing down the rules and responsibilities that the Anunnaki gave to them, almost like an emissary that works for someone that's very powerful. They're the ones who are supposed to then use all of that knowledge, the tools to create a civilization, the knowledge, the laws handed down to them, specific laws. It was all under one umbrella called kingship. Everywhere is the same phrase. Kingship was lowered. Kingship was lowered here. Kingship was lost, then re-lowered. And we're going to get into that in a second. But essentially, you have the Anunnaki having these bloodline kings that they feel are superior, that should rule over the rest of society. They're telling them the way to create those civilizations and how to govern them. And in the center, you have the Zoroastrian symbol with Anu, who's basically pulling the wheels. He's on almost like the bike of life. He's the one who's in charge of all of the Anunnaki in balance. So when you put the whole thing together, it's like the Anunnaki are creating a specific type of kingship civilization for our societies here in their image, in their likeness, and their mentality. Okay. And that's what I think is so interesting, though. If we go back a little bit, just notice how often they're depicted with an eagle head, though, not a regular head and not a serpent head. It's actually quite rare. You do see it like when I showed you in La Venta, the Olmec, how they show Kukulkan coming up with the serpent. Yeah, it's there, but it's much more rare. What does that mean? It means that the majority of the time, the Anunnaki, when they were creating these civilizations, created them to be warlike empires, which is why throughout history, it's always been governed by war, because it's the easiest way to control civilizations and keep them in a lower state of consciousness. There's always been this battle of the Anunnaki where they didn't want us to become greater than them. And that's what a lot of these struggles have been.